Join the only roundtable podcast in compliance with 5 of the top commentators in compliance. Mike Volkov brings 35 years of legal experience. Matt Kelly is the founder and editor of Radical Compliance. Sarah Haddon is the publisher of Corporate Compliance Insights. Jay Rosen is Mr. Monitor, who knows his way around the culture of compliance. And Jonathan Armstrong, a partner at Cordery Compliance in London, rounds out this top group of compliance practitioners. Check out the rants and shout-out at the end of each episode. Hosted by Tom Fox, the voice of compliance. Everything Compliance is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
This is Tom Fox. In this special edition of Everything Compliance, we take a look at various issues related to coronavirus. Matt Kelly considers getting back to business in the age of coronavirus. Jonathan Armstrong considers data privacy, data protection. Special guest Jonathan Marks talks about crisis management and what the board needs to look at. Jay Rosen talks about doing culture assessments now as more important than ever. And I conclude with some thoughts on what a compliance officer can do. Rants and shout-outs are at the end. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you enjoy it.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox with a special coronavirus, COVID-19, and all things in between episode. Today, we are going to start with Matt Kelly. Matt, what is on your mind around COVID-19?
Yeah. Hi, Tom. Well, I have been thinking a lot about how corporate America is going to try to get back to business sometime soon. We don't know exactly when, but after whatever lockdowns are happening, after they, sorry to do this, but I've got a lot of background noise from somebody. Hate to break the flow here. I'll try taking it from the top.
Not a problem. Just take a 5-second silent count and start over.
Yep. So, Tom, I've been thinking a lot about companies trying to get back to business sometime soon, this summer, a couple of weeks. We don't know when, but whenever business can get back to semi-normal business, when we start lifting lockdowns and restrictions on who can or cannot be open, how's that actually going to work? Because what that experience will not be, and I think many companies get this now, but maybe about 6 weeks ago when we started this, I don't think we grasped this. But what it will not be is that somebody somewhere suddenly declares coronavirus is over and we flip a switch and everything goes back to normal the way it was in February or January. That is not going to happen. So I have been wondering, as companies start thinking about infectious disease control, how are they going to integrate those kind of public health principles into their daily operations? Because that's what is going to need to happen to be able to get to at least semi-normal, semi-open operations. So what would that look like? And I would say that is related to, but it isn't the same as, a pandemic response program. And, Tom, you and I have already talked about pandemic risk response programs, and everybody likes to talk about pandemic. I would say pandemics involve larger issues around travel bans or supply chain instability or cybersecurity when everyone is all working from home. And those things are all important, but they are not the same as what I'm talking about, which is when you are trying to do business with an infectious disease still out there to some extent. And COVID is going to be around for a long time. So I have talked with a couple of compliance officers about the Infectious Disease Outbreak Response Program, which they have wonderfully called the IDORP, and how IDORPs, which companies I think will need to have, they are more about how you manage and control and reduce the spread of illness in your workforce. And we are going to need to develop those kind of capabilities now so we can adjust to some sort of semi-open economy over the summer and maybe even ideally a fully open economy by the fall or 2021. But this can be really nitty-gritty stuff. So how would you monitor the health of employees? Would you take their temperature? Would you have a policy for when they can come into the office? And I know, for example, a compliance officer at a large manufacturer with big operations in Hubei province in China, where they have a policy now that only allows employees are only allowed in 2 days a week into the office. These are the white-collar managerial employees. They also have factory employees, but at the management level, you're only allowed into the office 2 days a week so that the building is never more than about 40% full, and you can have social distancing while you're kind of, sort of still operating an actual office. So how do you do these sort of things? How do you figure out what are the changes you're going to need to make right on site? I will give you another example that's happening in Massachusetts right now is supermarkets. All aisles in Massachusetts supermarkets now are supposed to be alternating one-way flow. And you also have to put maybe plexiglass stations, plexiglass barriers between the cashier and the customer at every single checkout. That is another thing that's happening in Massachusetts. I'm not quite sure if that's required by regulation or not, but limiting the number of employees or visitors who come into your facility at any given time, which is something the state is regulating in Massachusetts. So all of these really specific operating procedures that are going to have to go into place, you're going to need to develop those changes to procedure. You're going to need clear policies that ideally are going to fit to some sort of public health standard about when those policies do or don't kick into effect, depending on how widespread COVID might be in one area versus another area. And you bet, folks, we're going to have a patchwork quilt of operational changes that we're going to have to manage. So I keep on coming back to the idea that this is a compliance risk management sort of exercise. Walk through the steps at an abstract level. It's pretty clear. You do a risk assessment. You find the gaps. You develop remediation steps. You implement the improvements. You test them and all of that. That is what the audit risk compliance industrial complex, that's what we've been doing for years. And we're going to need to do this for infectious disease control. And then on top of all of that, you are going to need to track all sorts of public health requirements at the local level, the state level, the global level, the national level. You'll need to consider, what do the employees want? And I am also, at this point, I'm calling this right now, everybody, I will bet you an N95 mask or the street value thereof, which these days I'm pretty sure is the same as my mortgage payment. But I will bet you that the Trump administration is going to start repealing some lockdown requirements where state and localities say, no, we're not going to go along with this. And then what are you going to do? If you have the president saying one thing, yeah, this is not a big deal. And then the governors and the mayors are saying, no, this is a big deal. We're not doing this. And employees are caught in the middle trying to figure out what they want. How are you going to placate all of these various constituencies? That's something that operational executives are going to have to think about. And compliance officers, since they are in the field of developing policies and procedures and testing everything, you should be in the thick of that. The other thing that I will make a prediction on is I will bet you at some point, Attorney General Bill Barr is going to try to challenge state governors' authority when they don't bend to the Trump administration, which very clearly, as of today, looks like they want to lift these lockdown restrictions by the beginning of May. There's no public health grounding in that right now. What are the sort of ways that you're going to navigate all of these constituencies? And I haven't even mentioned consumers. If you are a retail-facing business, how are you going to figure out what is the right policy? What is the right procedure? When do we turn it on? When do we turn it off? There is some great guidance out there for IDORP plans and programs about who runs it, what it should contain. I have some links to it on my blog, and Tom, you and I have talked about this before, but that's the sort of thing that is on my mind right now, is that we have a tremendously complex scenario that's coming within weeks about how you're going to try to turn your business operations back on in this very volatile kind of world, volatile on the regulatory level, on the risk level, on the public health level. We have no roadmap for how we're supposed to do this, and we're going to have to write it up on the fly. And I would strongly recommend ethics and compliance officers and risk executives like you be in the room when your company's trying to write up that playbook, because that is coming, and that's going to be a tricky challenge.
Matt, I know you have talked to some compliance officers or corporate executives around the IDORPs, and you have written extensively about that. do you have the sense, or have you talked to compliance or other business executives who not only are thinking about some of the questions you posed, but actually trying to sit down and put out a roadmap for their organizations?
Well, some are trying. And so, for example, I wrote about one compliance officer I know. He's at a tech services firm where he happened to write one in the beginning of the year before all of this blew up in the news. Talk about a good stroke of timing. So his IDORP plan is, at the oversight level, it's not that different than any other sort of risk program you might have. You need to have a plan, you need to write it down, you need to have people assigned to do different things. Well, that's just as true of any other sort of compliance or risk management program. What's specific here is the policies and procedures and the steps you would put in place for disease control. So he goes right down to the actual temperature that an employee cannot have and still come to work, which I think is 100 degrees or above. They can't come to work. They specify actually that it needs to be a commercially available thermometer. You can't just put your hand on your head and figure, I feel kind of warm, I should stay home, or it feels kind of cool, I'm going to go in. Like, they're going to take temperatures. You're going to, at a large company with people coming and going in a facility, you might think about somebody at the front door taking everyone's temperature, and you're going to record that data. What's going to happen to that data? How do you know? They have this compliance officer I know, they have a policy about when you can return to work. If you do have a fever, you have to be fever free for more than, I think, 48 hours. They talk about hand sanitizer, and if you don't have soap and water to wash hands, you can use an alcohol-based sanitizer, which must be at least, I think, 60% alcohol. And this is really specific stuff. But that's the sort of thing we're going to need to think about, which compliance officers normally don't think about it. I'd never thought about disease control until about 4 weeks ago. There are resources out there. There is some guidance. You're going to need to think about, how do I tie all of these steps we take to what level of public health crisis? Who decides that? What public health authority am I talking about? Is it the city? Is it the state? Is it the World Health Organization? You're going to need to answer all of that. And I have come across some very good frameworks for it. But like I said, I've been writing about ethics and compliance and risk management 17 years. I've never thought about this until March. Everybody is going to have to start thinking about it. Healthcare people probably have a good leg up on how to write it out and how to try to put it into effect. But we are all going to need to put this into effect at every type of business, including businesses that typically might not have thought about compliance and risk management in any disciplined way. Food shops. A lot of groceries I know are not big publicly traded companies. They're rather small, but they're going to need to think about this too. Every business will need to think about this.
Jonathan Marks, do you have a question for Matt?
Matt, my question is very simple. What you do in the U.S. might be a little bit different than you do in other parts of the globe. So how do you fit this all in globally?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And my first answer, honestly, is I'm not really sure. I think that, you will, like any other sort of multi-jurisdiction risk management program or compliance program, you will need to figure this out. You will need to think through things like probably personal health data information and privacy and how you might handle that. Jonathan might want to touch on this soon, but my understanding is that Jonathan Armstrong, our GDPR expert, my understanding is that the GDPR has a big carve out for public health data in a public health emergency, which we do have, but I don't know for sure. I think that you will have to think about different sort of constituencies. Like, it's generally considered around the world. The U.S. is not doing that good of a job, and there are others who are in other countries. What if employees over in a different jurisdiction don't want to obey U.S. standards, which if I were South Korean or German, I wouldn't necessarily want to, because they clearly are doing better than we are. I don't know what all of these answers are, but this is not just one multi-dimensional game of chess. Like, how many games of multi-dimensions can we have in the chess game? But that's what we're going to have to try to figure out.
Jonathan Armstrong, it seems to me that there are almost innumerable data privacy, data protection issues raised in this time of not only coronavirus crisis, but economic downturn. How do you begin to think through those issues, and what are you and your Coterie colleagues beginning to tell your clients or counsel them on?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Matt and Jonathan M have raised some interesting issues. And it is something I think that we've seen already data privacy regulators pitch in on. We've been tracking announcements from regulators across the globe. There are now more than 40 data protection authorities have issued specific guidance on COVID and data protection. It's not quite an A to Z, but it's an A to U, with Australia and the UK bookending that advice. And some of those regulators have issued different papers on different things and have mini portals in place now, even regulators that you wouldn't have thought would be so organized, like Slovenia. And there's a link to those 40 on our website. But I think that as Matt and Jonathan M have alluded to, this isn't easy. And Matt is right that there is a sort of exemption for health data. But that's really difficult for an employer to get through. It's not quite as difficult as passing through the eye of a needle, but it's predicated on necessity. And of course, many multinational organizations do things because they're convenient rather than necessary. So we get back to all of those debates we had over helplines, for example. Were they necessary under local law? And some regulators have put down markers to the fact that they're going to be unforgiving, particularly with multinationals. It's the first time I can recall, for example, that the Italian, the Garante, the Italian Data Protection Authority, has issued guidance in English. And the reason I hear that they've done that is because they specifically think US corporations do things like monitoring on employees where that's not necessary in their view. And so their guidance with their translation says employers must refrain from collecting in advance and in a systematic and generalized manner, including through specific requests to the individual worker or unauthorized investigations, information on the presence of any signs of influenza in the worker and his or her closest contacts, or anyhow regarding areas outside the work environment. So perhaps in the work environment, they can do the testing of the type that Matt describes, in the parking lot or whatever. But I think in some respects, this is where corporations have an opportunity to be what they want to be in terms of the employee-employer relationship. And I think there's all sorts of interesting studies that we're seeing here on organizations looking at the reputation they want to have when they come out of this. So we've heard criticism, for example, of Virgin and Richard Branson, particularly in the UK, the golden child of many, but a significant number of people saying, I will never fly Virgin again, because a brand that's traded on its feel-good factor is perceived to be treating employees badly. So Matt is right that this is a critical turning point for organizations, but it's a critical turning point for them with their employees and also with how people perceive them to be treating their employees. From a data protection point of view, you are going to need to do what's called a data protection impact assessment to work through things like monitoring of employees in terms of health data. You're also going to need to do that if you're asking them to work from home, because obviously GDPR has significant security ramifications as well. So if you're telling more people to work home than normally work from home, you're going to need to go through a data protection impact assessment for that. We've all sorts of issues around monitoring, which is difficult, not only health monitoring, but also some organizations are saying, well, when Susan and Sarah sit opposite me, I know how much they're working, and sometimes Susan isn't emailing me within an hour. So I want to check her working from home to see if she's actually shut up shop and she's outside sunbathing or whatever that might be. That's something that I see a lot of US corporations particularly do, particularly middle managers who aren't that good at managing their team remotely. And that's another area where data protection has a real role to play. And then it seems to me that there are all sorts of challenges, not just health challenges, with things like, people working remotely. How do we tell them that the compliance messages that we would normally give them face-to-face still apply? If I'm a salesman on the ground in Angola, how do I persuade him that just because I've got less chance of catching him, and just because I'm not going to see him once a quarter and tell him not to be a bad guy, that doesn't mean to say he can be a bad guy, particularly when at least the anecdotal evidence is that there is more crime out there, both in terms of petty officials asking for bribes to speed things up through ports or borders, or in terms of these hideous ransomware attacks that we're seeing, particularly on healthcare organizations, because they know that hospitals need their systems, that they're more critical, and as a result, they're more likely to pay. And if the news is true, the Travelex have just paid one of these guys a large ton of money, then we're going to see more and more ransomware attacks, which again puts this critical front line between the compliance professional and the compliance of the organization and those out there. So I think these are really, really tricky times. It's obviously a time for cool heads in some respects. A lot of the things that we see are somewhat reactive. And I think where a compliance officer can really earn their spurs here is in being that cool head in a crisis, and sometimes being the voice of customers and sometimes being the voice of employees, but always being the voice of reason and saying, is this the best way of achieving what we're trying to achieve? And should we, as Matt was saying, try and plan out our response rather than just react?
Jonathan, could you detail a little bit about the Travelex case? Because I think it really applies to the current situation hospitals and healthcare providers find themselves in. And I don't want to say it was a horrific result, but it certainly puts a lot of incentive on bad actors.
Yeah, it does. So, of course, this is breaking news as we speak, and this isn't necessarily confirmed, but we do know that Travelex had a ransomware attack. We understand that they did not report it to regulators, which is an unusual decision. It could be the correct one, but most ransomware attacks do have to be reported under GDPR within 72 hours. We know that at some stage they had some help from government organizations to get back and running. But the news that we've heard just recently is that they actually did pay a ransom. So for those of you who are not familiar with ransomware, it is more or less what it says on the tin. Usually it's what's called a phishing attack or a watering hole attack. So a threat, a piece of software comes along either via email or via somebody's web browsing, and it locks data on the machine. And usually you are then asked to pay an amount in Bitcoin or some other cyber currency to unlock your system. Now, of course, there's no guarantee that the unlock works. And of course, it's always slightly surprising to me that organizations, rely on the honor of people who are criminals. I will give you, if the allegations are right, $2.3 million, and I'll trust you to unlock the systems. But we know that Travelex it has had particular issues. Their shares have fallen 65%, apparently, with the virus from what was already quite a low base because of the issues that they'd had with ransomware. And by all accounts, their exchange bureaus in places like Heathrow were back to manual, like the cabin doors on a plane, the people literally exchanging money and writing in a big ledger the deal they'd done and the exchange rate, etc. So ransomware attacks are pretty prevalent. All of the statistics seem to say that they're on the up. The UK and US security services issued a joint communique yesterday. That's the 9th, for those who are listening to recording, 9th April, which is pretty helpful in the measures that you can take to prevent yourself. We've done an alert that's on the Caudry website as well. But the particularly insidious thing here, as I say, is that they're preying on healthcare organizations. We've had some dealings with some hospitals in the UK where they just had to cancel operations, close down emergency rooms because of ransomware. Because obviously, if you can't access things like people's blood type or their medical history, then some procedures aren't safe to carry out. So watch out for these gangs. They're certainly buoyed anyway, I think, by the increased success rate that it's perceived that they're having in this crisis. And as I say, $2.3 million of success with Travelex, if that is the case, will mean that we have more of these attacks and not less.
Jonathan, can there be a basic reconciliation in the coronavirus crisis of the differences between personal data in Europe and the United States because of the need for increased healthcare information, or is that something that's just going to be too much of a river for any bridge to cross?
I think you can cross the bridge. And I think when we've done exercises like this for clients, there are, a number of tips I could give you. As I say, the data protection impact assessment, I think, is going to be necessary. These are extreme times, and you can occasionally put in, data privacy threatening measures if you do it for a short space of time. So one of the things that we've been doing with clients is shelf-lifing DPIAs and shelf-lifing new processes. So we're saying, okay, there's a health emergency. The authorities in the relevant country have declared it to be a health emergency. We are going to do this particular processing of employee health data, let's say, for as long as the emergency is declared by government, plus a month after, for us to wind this application down. Or you've said, we're going to do this for the period of emergency plus a month and then review. I think if you do things like that and realize that extreme circumstances sometimes mean that you have to have extreme measures, but you all agree that you're going to review it once the emergency passes, then that these sort of processes are much more defensible. And there's all sorts of other things you can do around the 6 principles under GDPR. So let's take Matt's example of doing temperature checks. Then maybe the whole organization doesn't need to know. Maybe there's an on-site clinician at your factory in Bad Homburg in Germany, and maybe you can treat that as medical data that the on-site clinician possesses rather than the organization. And the clinician just says, I have asked Hans and Helga not to come in the office today, and maybe he doesn't pass on the reason why. So you can have barriers in place to enable you to look after the security of the workplace as a whole, the health security of people, whilst not victimizing individuals. It just requires some thought and some planning. And as I say, the data protection impact assessment process will help you do that. And you also, as I say, have to look at the short-term nature of this. So if you've turned somebody away at the factory door because their temperature was high, well, maybe you need to know that for the next 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 4 weeks. But you don't need to put that on their medical records. You don't need to put that on their employee records forevermore. And why things like this are going to become critical, I think, is if I talk to many of our clients, they know that if recession hits, some of these workers that they've furloughed, some of these facilities that they have temporarily closed down may not reopen. And we know that whenever we hit recession, things like data privacy claims go up, because obviously in a great economy, people don't tend to sue as much because they go from one role to another. But in a declining economy, if you're out of work, then you probably are going to sue. And if people haven't done the data privacy steps correctly, then they're walking into big class actions, I think, from employees who don't return back to the organization.
Jonathan Marks, you have written about the COVID-19 health crisis from both a crisis management perspective, the role of the board of directors, and several other areas. But I wanted to ask you, in terms of crisis management, how are you advising clients to?
I think it's a great question and a tricky one, because not everyone has a mature crisis response plan or they understand crisis governance. So, I'm a visual person. So when we're talking to clients and we're dealing with specific issues related to crisis and crisis management, I look at a few key core things. Since compliance is near and dear to my heart, we certainly look at, how they're dealing with compliance, legal, information security, insurance requirements, how they're dealing with stakeholder relations and their communication plans. And then lastly, their business continuity planning, as sort of the nucleus. And then, kind of outside of that, Tom, some of the things that we're looking at are, and we have to really understand, from a cultural perspective, really what the organization is about, because, there's an old adage from a governance perspective, nose in, fingers off. However, in a crisis situation, there may be a situation where you have to rebalance your level of oversight, and where senior leadership does not have the talent or the skills, maybe to overstep that a little bit and provide a helping hand. Sort of playing off of that, one of the things, again, that we're looking at sort of outside of that nucleus is, the full board needs to reevaluate the enterprise-wide risks and those emerging risks, and they need to continue to evaluate that. And how is that being done? Are they proactive? Because as we all know, proactivity is rewarded. And if you're going to let the grass grow underneath your feet, you could, put yourself in harm's way. There needs to be a separation of what's urgent from what's important. And again, these might be sort of trite comments, but they're really important in really dealing with a crisis. And then the last thing, which I saved last on purpose, is there's a great opportunity here and a real need to reinforce good business practice and ethics. And, we talk about tone from the top, and, we talk about culture, and sometimes, there are amorphous concepts, but, in a crisis situation, when we're talking to our clients, we are reinforcing the fact that they need to continue with that messaging, that we need to be making good, solid business decisions. And those are based on good, solid business practices and the values of the organization, and that, the breach of ethics will not be tolerated. There's also a couple of other things that lay outside that, such as, we're looking at escalation protocols. So in other words, the speed of onset of a particular risk that they're monitoring, how is that going to be dealt with? And what's the decision flow process? That really is sort of the diagnostic approach, to the first 10 minutes of a conversation that we're having with clients.
Is that something, Jonathan, that clients are able to incorporate into a business process when people are working remotely or working from home, or does that put additional challenges or pressures onto this diagnostic framework that you've laid out?
It definitely puts challenges and pressures. I mean, taking your assembled workforce and pushing them out remotely certainly has its own challenges. Some organizations have already gone to that model, so there may be less of an impact, but more of a strain. But from a communication perspective and really, understanding and being in a meeting live and getting the feel of that meeting is a lot different than doing it over like we're doing today, over a video conference. And so, those have their own challenges. It's not that you can't overcome them. I think you just have to be more aware. And so, from an awareness perspective, that's one of the things that we're talking about with our clients is that sort of the human element of all of this, which, tends to get left out is, when you're communicating with somebody live, it's a lot different than when you're communicating with them, over a video chat. And I think that's something that, really needs, we'll wait and see how that all plays out.
Jonathan, let me pick up on something you just commented on, the human element, but let me tie that into something I've seen you write about consistently over the years, which are controls. In this environment, can a company rely on sort of automated controls, whether that be an SAP, Oracle, or other ERP system, or does there need to be a human element overseeing those controls so that there can be a determination if there's control override, control circumvention, or someone just not even utilizing the controls?
Tom, that's a great point. I think that there's when there's an over reliance on, I'll call it, using technology to monitor things or things of that nature, and there is no human, element to that, I think that's certainly a problem. One of the things that we're seeing is people's roles are shifting a little bit. They're tasked with, handling pieces of the business continuity plan. And so, other folks are stepping into those particular roles, or they're trying to cover off those roles, or even in worse situations, where you have, let's say, a 4 eyes principle where, somebody else needs to review a transaction from an authority matrix perspective, or a control that's been put in place to achieve a certain objective. Those are being uncovered. And so, there's an opportunity for those to kind of sneak through. So one of the things that we are really, really stressing hard is, not only taking a look at the risks, but also taking a look at the shift of the assembled workforce and what are their new roles and responsibilities, and what areas within the organization pose the greatest risk that are not being attended to, and how do we refocus our risk efforts and make sure that we can employ things like maybe using internal audit or people in the compliance function to look at those particular things while we're going through this particular crisis and while we're executing on our business continuity plan.
And Jonathan, one of the other things that I've seen you write consistently on is not only the fraud triangle, but more focused the fraud pentagon. Is the increase in pressure that a company, that a geographic region, that a salesman might even feel, not only in the time of coronavirus crisis, but in the economic dislocation that we're all under, something that the fraud examiner in you has your spider sense tingling as well?
Everyone out there that has a assembled workforce where there's sales involved, and if your business is atrophied, like many have as a result of this, there's always the desire to make up for what they perceive to be lost. And so there's a great deal of pressure exerted on, those types of individuals that have compensation that's variable or commission based. And so pressure definitely leads to rationalization, but there's also a sense, from a senior leadership perspective of, arrogance and competence. The arrogance piece is, let's override controls just once, in order to achieve some objective that we're trying to, that we have in front of us. And, the competence piece is, certainly the ability to sell it to others that it's really okay. Or, get other people to do something that they really shouldn't be doing, but for the fact that, they feel pressured into doing this because they might lose their jobs. And so there really is a fine line there when it comes to, looking at the culture of an organization, the assembled workforce, and, looking at, there's always there's this great statistic out there that the ACFE throws out that, basically 5% of all revenues, revenues result in fraud, or 5 or 10% or whatever it is. There's some other organizations that say it's higher depending on, the nature of your company. And, that may or may not be true. But what I'm more concerned about is, if you have 5% of your organization that are fraudsters, and you have, basically you might have people that are in the middle there, 80% that are situationally ethical, and, maybe 15% that are completely ethical, or, 10-80-10, split it out any way you want. Where do we focus our efforts when it comes to those that are situationally ethical, and what type of pressures are being put on people? And, if we continue to do that, then they're going to look for loopholes or things of that nature, which may be legal, but may be unethical, and put the corporation in a situation where it could embarrass them from a reputational perspective. So, I do like writing about the fact that, pressure, opportunity, and rationalization have really taken on a different twist, at least in my world, with regards to arrogance and competence. But I do really think that we can learn from, the 2008 financial crisis and what was done there, and other crises where you've seen, leadership in organizations that have, used the crisis as a crutch for, committing, bad behavior or hiding bad behavior that may have been inherent in the organization, and using this as an opportunity to either flush it out or continue down that ugly path.
Jay Rosen, one of the things that you have written about and your affiliated monitor colleagues talk about is culture assessments, and how important corporate culture is for an ethics and compliance program and an ethics and compliance officer. So the question I really wanted to explore with you, Jay, is what is a culture assessment, and keeping your finger on the pulse of a culture even more important in the era of COVID-19? And if it is, how can you do so when you're working remotely or having to do remote culture assessments?
Great questions, Tom. Thanks for having me on. Within the past couple weeks, you had started a new podcast called Compliance and Coronavirus, and you decided to take a look at all different perspectives on the growing crisis. And during this time, you had a couple of my affiliated monitors colleagues participate in your podcast, Vinny, who is the founder of the company, and Eric Feldman. And specifically, you and Eric spoke about how affiliated monitors has been able to continue our proactive monitoring and a variety of other strategies that we used with the outbreak of the coronavirus. One of the things that we've talked about over the past several months, and actually the past several years on blog posts and podcasts, is culture assessments, and how an independent oversight monitor can help companies understand where their corporate culture may be, and then use this information to improve on an ongoing basis to make sure your compliance program is more effective. Obviously, the coronavirus is presenting challenges to almost every business, and I think in compliance, it's going to be an even greater challenge trying to assess the impact of a coronavirus and social isolation of culture of companies. We in the compliance community often talk about corporate communication being the most important thing in corporate messaging. A company needs to let employees know what's expected of them in terms of behavior. So if employees are working remotely, that messaging and that frequent contact becomes even more important. What we're seeing and hearing is that there are risks that are developing with employees who work remotely, not just the risk of employees not putting in their hours. Of course, that's always there. But now there's a risk of employees feeling anxious, feeling like their jobs may be cut. When people feel that way, they may take actions that they would not normally take in less stressful circumstances. We've seen some companies that are working with a response to this through frequent remote team meetings, conversations that are transparent about where the company is going, discussing honesty and transparency about the organization and how it's faring financially through the crisis so employees can understand what to expect. It goes without saying, hiding things from them is not helpful at all. One of the things that we've recently faced is we've had to do work for both monitoring and cultural assessments remotely. Here's a live example. From one client, we had already been set up to do this kind of work before the lockdown situation. We had already been set up to have a series of interviews on a monitoring engagement of the company that has an agreement with a government agency. As the interview times were set up, the entire monitorship, the quarterly monitoring was arranged. We had already reviewed documents which were sent electronically, and all we did was convert the interviews from in-person interviews in 3 different cities to video conferencing using Microsoft Teams. And what we found, the lesson learned, is that this can be done really just as easily and with equal effectiveness by looking at a person on a screen and having the same kind of conversation that you'd have in person. And it worked, and we were able to glean the information we needed to further help the company. The only thing that might be a little bit more difficult is to run focus groups. When you have 15 people in a room trying to read body language and get people to be honest and not have side conversations that you can't see on camera, it's a bit more challenging. So we may need to reduce the number of people in focus groups. In our work, the professionals at Affiliated Monitors have probably interviewed thousands of people over the years. And these skills that we bring to the interview process over the years are very much the same set of skills you need now in the age of video conferencing. When you're interviewing someone, you're trying to read tone, body language. You can tell when a person may be hesitant to respond, and you can tell when someone has information that they're not quite sure they want to share with you, and you may have to make them a bit more confident before they can share it. Doing it remotely on a screen is, of course, a little bit more difficult to read a person, but nonetheless, it can be done. The initial solution would be to reduce the number of focus group attendees to perhaps 5 or 6, so you can see them across the screen, with whatever video conferencing technique you might be able to use, and garner a little more comfort in and playing using that strategy. That's what's going to end up happening if things continue the way that we are with people working from home. After we get past the technical components of using video conferencing to actually talk, we'll use this information we receive back of such quality that we can use it to advise companies or at least give them information on the direction they may need to go. In all respects, it's really the same. In our process of assessing culture of a company proactively, the first thing that we need to do is send out a request for documents and information about the status of the company's ethics and compliance program. Questions such as how the company is structured organizationally. When we take a look at some of those trends and hotline complaints that may have occurred, concurrently, we do all this now electronically, and we request documents that are sent to us and put into electronic files, and we review them electronically. We've been doing this for many, many years, and so there's really no difference in the current process. We still have to schedule interviews when you want to talk to someone. We just don't barge into an office if we're at the company, so this can be accomplished electronically. And the interview is asking people their thoughts about culture, about work, and how they feel about work, whether they feel appreciated, whether they feel they're in a speak-up culture. These are still the same key aspects of assessing the effectiveness of corporate culture. Earlier, I spoke about employees who may feel isolated, perhaps even alienated in general mental health issues that perhaps compliance practitioners don't think about as much as we should. In the process of performing a culture assessment, that can actually be one part of the solution to help isolation and help decrease alienation by having internal focus groups, by requiring employees to be together on a video conference call to talk about culture issues, ethics issues. And in a way, this is a little bit different than the way they're normally used to, but it may actually provide some relief from some of the alienation. So when we do focus groups and we do cultural assessments, even in the traditional mode, we often refer to the process as being cathartic for the people in the organization. People like the opportunity to be able to give their opinions and to speak and to be asked what they think. And often we find that there's a buzz around the company when we do a culture assessment, and people feel good that the company cared enough about them to arrange for this to happen. Because of economic crisis that we're in right now, with people working from home, with perhaps a little bit more time in their hand, this may afford a great time for a company to perform a cultural assessment because of the added benefits in terms of the cathartic experience, as we discussed, and getting away from the feeling of utter alienation. That might now really be a good time to put this in place. And if some people may have some extra time on their hands, and if they are in the comfort of the home, their own house, this may be a way to reach out to them and to try to address some of the anxiety and concern. So it may be an appropriate time, and with the cost of video conferencing being quite reasonable, to perform a culture assessment without travel costs involved and without going to locations, which is usually optimal. Before going that, cost is going to be much less at this time. So during this challenging time, what better way to test the strength of your company's culture than to find out how your employees are reacting to the state of emergency? You know, we are living in challenging times when you get to see the true strength of a person's character and an organization's culture when it's challenged, not when times are good, but when things are bad. And that could be very revealing for some companies. It's an opportunity not to criticize individuals, nor to criticize the company, but to address some of those cracks in the company's foundation during this point in time, which will help them move forward when things go back to normal. So we at Affiliated Monitors think it's a perfect time to do a culture assessment.
Jay, I think Jonathan Marks had a couple of questions for you.
I just have one question in 24 different parts. No, I'm kidding. No, that's a great outline there, Jay. But I had a couple things. Number one is, since we're on video right now, can you see me tapping my feet?
No, but I imagined you, rocking out playing the bongo drums during certain parts of my talk.
Right. So, I mean, one of the things that we're struggling with, I mean, and obviously it's probably becoming sort of the new normal, is using video conferencing for investigations and investigative interviews. So how do you deal with when you're talking with people, like even in an interview, even when you're interviewing or discussing, things from a cultural assessment perspective, those nonverbal cues are very, instrumental for me. And I've been trained in those when conducting an interview, and the second part of that is, can you, either anyone on the call today or the podcast, how do you build rapport with somebody over a video chat? I mean, these are some of the things that we're kind of dealing with right now. And I thought maybe you had some thoughts or ideas, and maybe we could just kind of spitball with those questions.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Jonathan. I think one of the things we've seen over the last 6 weeks is people have moved with trepidation to, how do we continue to conduct the goals of our business? How do we meet with people? How do we conduct meetings? And now, unfortunately, everybody, including your parents and my parents and people's grandparents, are now all Zoom experts. And there's been quite a quick adoption of this technology, whether it's Zoom or MS Teams. So, of course, the best thing would be to be in the same room with the person, to look for those nonverbal cues, to cast your keen investigator's eyes. But as a quick second choice, this seems to be working out well. And you're still gonna you small things, but I would say that from our experience, just running this live example that I spoke about, things went really well. And the only thing that, from our perspective, is what we're going to need to tweak a little bit more is, looking at what happens when we do the focus groups. But Jonathan and Tom, what's been your experience over the last few weeks with video and chat and conferencing?
Well, I've had something even more odd, where for various reasons we were doing an investigation into sexual misconduct. And it was a very senior member in the organization around the annual Christmas party and bad behavior there. And for various reasons, not of my choice at all, the only opportunity we had with some of the witnesses to the incident was audio only. They would only agree to speak to us audio at 8 o'clock in the evening, away from the work environment. And just as I think you were indicating, Jonathan, not my preference at all, but you talk to them there or you don't talk to them at all. And that was eye-opening for me. I thought we actually got more information out of people in that environment when all you could do was try and build rapport with your voice. And it's a real tricky thing, isn't it? I was reflecting and, listening back to some of my questions. I ended up thinking I vaguely sounded like Fraser Crane, like you're saying to people, tell me what happened. I'm listening. And you got a lot of information from people. And because of I won't get into the detail of the investigation, but it wasn't as necessary as some are to get that, actual forensic element to it. You were almost, with these particular witnesses, trying to collect anecdotes almost. But I found that it was possible. And I think you're right, Jay, that people are getting much more comfortable, that the learning curve on comfort around seeing people remotely is exponential at the moment. And I think we will get to a day when even investigations, relatively minor investigations, but even some investigations will be speaking to witnesses. We've got court hearings in the UK. At the moment, the rule seems to be that you can have any court hearing where the judge is going to decide. The trials involving juries are suspended because it's perceived that jury can't handle Zoom as well as a judge can. But if we can still have full-blown court hearings go ahead, and judges feel they can ascertain the sort of probity of witnesses via Zoom, then I suspect we'll find it hard to argue that some investigations can't continue in this climate.
And Jonathan, from my perspective, what I have been focusing on is the eyes. So we can see each other for the purposes of this podcast, although it's not a video podcast. And we are all much closer to the camera than we would be if we're sitting across the table. I know, Jonathan Marks, you have written and talked about reading the body language, and specifically or more holistically body. And that's something that I was trained to as well. And I tend to watch when I'm across the table from someone, their body, because I get more signals from their body. But by forcing myself to refocus on the eyes, and I'm close enough with a video monitor that I can see the eyes quite well, just as I can see all of your lion eyes sitting across from me. And a British Bulldog's eyes as well. Churchill has joined us. So it's been a learning experience for me to focus on one signal that I'd not typically focused on before. But I think the consensus of this group seems to be that we are adapting and we're finding different ways to pick up those nonverbal cues. And in Jonathan Armstrong's case, he was able to utilize verbal cues without the visual component. So I guess it's going to be a learning experience for us all. So, gentlemen, I wanted to take this time to give some thoughts about what some kind of nuts and bolts things that a compliance practitioner might do. And as you all know, I've started a new podcast series, Compliance and Coronavirus, that I've been talking to lots of different people about some of the things. So some of these ideas I've purloined from some of my guests, and some I've been talking about for some time. But and many of them you guys have talked about, so I'm not going to reemphasize those, although I'll just highlight them. And one of is messaging and your compliance messaging, and why now, when people are alone, separate and apart, working from home, your compliance messaging is even more important. And that really moves even to alienation. So when Jay talked about that in the context of the cultural assessment and the cathartic impact that can have from someone working from home as opposed to perhaps a group in an office. The next thing is don't sweat the small stuff. If you're a nervous Nelly as a compliance officer, now would be a really good time to put into practice the maxim, don't sweat the small compliance stuff. You don't need to waste your scarce resources on areas or matters that have low compliance risks. If your sales force is third-party based, that's your highest risk. If your sales force is employee-based with compensation incentivized to the amount of sales, that's your highest risk. Where are you doing business? Is it a high-risk area? Do you sell a high-risk product or service? So don't sweat the small stuff. And that conversely to that is know your risks. What are your risks? How do you know your risks going forward? And have you assessed your risks? There are some technological things you can put into place if you don't have them now. But all of these are tempered with Jonathan Marks' remarks that you have to have the human element involved. So your third-party management system, is that automated? Your internal controls, is that automated? And then ongoing monitoring of the sales process, is that automated? Once again, though, you have to have the human element oversight on that. Some of the other things, and Jonathan Marks talked about the internal controls component, so I'm really not going to reemphasize that, but time horizons. Tricia Cornell, a principal at Rethink Compliance, said that compliance practitioners need to reconsider their time horizons. So literally, what are you going to get through today? What is your compliance team going to do today? How are you going to motivate your compliance team and keep them engaged? Are you going to have a daily call where you go through everyone's assignment for that day? What about for a 5-day time horizon? What about a 2-week time horizon? Is that too far out to plan in this environment where things are literally changing on an hourly basis, both from the regulatory angle, such as the Trump administration changing export controls yesterday, to the coronavirus increase or decrease in reported cases in your locality? And then 30 days and 60 days. I interviewed a business executive, Jeffrey Hazlett, founder of C-Suite Networks, and he said for every business, 60 days. You got to get through the next 60 days. How are you going to get through the next 60 days? What's your liquidity for the next 60 days? Now, it may be after a month, we're looking at 90 days. It may be after a month, things slow down. At this point, since we're in uncharted waters, it may be, but he said, keep your focus on how are you going to get through the next 60 days with what you have. So think about time horizons, perhaps in a way you hadn't done so before. I think that internal controls is extraordinarily important, once again tempered with Jonathan Marks' concerns that the human element. But one thing I want to focus on, or that ask the compliance practitioner rather to focus on, is what about your payment stream post-contract? Where is that money coming from? And if you're paying out money to third parties, where is it going? As a compliance practitioner in your third-party risk management, you may have focused an inordinate amount of your time on business justification, questionnaire, and due diligence. Well, now's the time to maybe look at after the contract is signed and really focused on that. And then the last thing I would like to emphasize is compliance never sleeps. And more importantly, enforcement never sleeps. Just today, the Securities and Exchange Commission made clear that their enforcement efforts will not be lapsing, will not be slowing down. They may loosen some rules, but you can't depend on that. Your filings, the disclosures you make are going to be under the same rules that existed 3 months ago, 6 months ago, and 3 months into the future. So any of the deadlines you have for filings, any of the regulatory requirements you're under, you need to fulfill those. If the government comes in and makes some changes, you at least have fulfilled your obligations. From the enforcement perspective, you also need to always remember, if there's a violation in April 2020, when we are recording this podcast, and it gets in front of the Department of Justice or Securities and Exchange Commission in 3 to 5 years, they're not going to remember this day. They're not going to remember this month. They're going to say, You had a bribe paid under your watch. Why did this happen? How did you allow it to happen? And what did you do to prevent it? They're not going to be concerned with, well, the employee was working from home. They're not going to be concerned with, well, no one was overseeing our internal controls to make sure there wasn't circumvention or override. No one is going to concern about the pressurization, increased pressure on the fraud Pentagon leg. They're going to be concerned with you had a violation, and they're going to look and enforce that violation as if it was 2024 or 2022. So it's a long way of saying that when the violation comes up for review by regulators, they're going to look at it in that time frame. And there is no COVID-19 compliance or corruption defense. So you must be ever vigilant. And I would say now you even have to double down on that. So those are some of my tips, kind of nuts and bolts things for the compliance practitioner. Gentlemen, we are now going to move to rants and or shout outs, and we will go with the same order. Mr. Matt Kelly, do you have a shout out or a rant for us?
I do actually have a shout out this month, Tom. I have a shout out to Michael Atkinson, the former Inspector General of the U.S. intelligence community, who was fired by President Trump on April 3rd. The president had no legitimate reason to fire Atkinson, who under federal law is only supposed to be fired for cause. And in the announcement why he was getting rid of Michael Atkinson, the president even just said, because I no longer have the confidence in Inspector General Atkinson, which interpret that as you will. But Michael Atkinson was a seasoned professional in the Inspector General community. The real reason that Trump fired Atkinson was because Atkinson had received that whistleblower complaint last year that the president was trying to bribe the Ukrainian government with foreign aid to investigate Joe Biden, and that complaint ultimately led to President Trump's impeachment hearings. That was why Trump fired Atkinson, really, because Atkinson did something Trump didn't like, and it forced Trump to face some accountability. Never mind that Michael Atkinson was just following the law, and he did everything by the book that an inspector general should do from start to finish. This was retaliation against a compliance professional for doing their job. It is shameful, but it's no surprise from somebody as corrupt and feckless as President Trump. We've all seen that before. We'll probably see it again. But nonetheless, the shout out is to Michael Atkinson, because any compliance officer here can appreciate the threat that we see all the time, that many of you have experienced personally. I bet you try to raise some allegation of misconduct by a senior executive, and what do? They retaliate against you. But Atkinson did his job to the end, and we should all admire him for that. So not only that, but I have every confidence that somebody as seasoned and skilled as Michael Atkinson will have no trouble getting a job in the private sector. But nonetheless, he was mistreated for doing his job, but he did his job anyways, and kudos to him for it. So that's my shout out to Michael Atkinson this week. Good for him.
Jonathan Armstrong.
Yeah, so mine is unfortunately a rant this week. I am conscious of the fact that we need to stay safe and protect health services, et cetera, My brother-in-law is in intensive care as we speak, so I'm acutely aware of that. However, one of the issues that we do have in the UK is the overreach of the police. This started with Derbyshire Police, where the area I'm speaking to you from at the moment, who sent a drone up and then used the police national computer to work out who was walking too far away from their home, and made a video exposing them and telling them that they'd broken the law when they hadn't. The law was not in and did not prohibit them exercising in that way. We've had, and by the way, Derbyshire Police, from what I understand, are yet to apologise. And as we've said, they don't seem to have a data protection impact assessment. And it seems that the only person who broke the law was Derbyshire Police rather than the individuals involved. In Cambridgeshire, we have had police officers saying that they were going to inspect shopping trolleys to see if anybody had anything in the trolley that wasn't essential. And a number of police officers saying that they were going to seize Easter eggs because chocolate was not essential in a crisis. Cambridgeshire police have apologised for being, quote, over-exuberant. In South Yorkshire, we had the police threaten to arrest people for using their own front garden because the police officer said exercise to the rear of the property was permitted, but not to the front of the property. Again, no such law exists. South Yorkshire Police called their police officer ill-informed. And in Northamptonshire, we've had a chief constable of the police say that he was going to set up roadblocks around Northamptonshire to stop vehicles and question them. He's now apologized and said that his wording was clumsy. Now, the essence of the law enforcement in the UK, to state the obvious, is there are not enough police to go around. They should be concentrating on law and order. They should be concentrating on policing by consensus. It is in the national interest that people take these regulations seriously. It is not in the national interest that we ban people commemorating Easter in whatever way they choose, within limits. People need to exercise. We've already talked, Jay's already talked very eloquently about the mental health issues that people are facing. We've got all sorts of people, domestic abuse is on the increase, who need to get out of the house, even if it's only for 30 minutes, to get some peace and quiet in their life. And we do not need police officers to behave unlawfully. We do not need police officers to make up laws and then enforce them in some ham-fisted way. So my rant is those police officers out there all around the world that are using their newfound powers for bad rather than for good. I give a marginal shout out to Cambridgeshire Police, to South Yorkshire Police, and to Northamptonshire Police for admitting their errors, for apologising, and getting with the programme that policing has to be by consent. And equally, my rant remains against Derbyshire Police for the unapologetic attitude they've had to what seems to be unlawful conduct.
Jonathan Marks.
There's a lot of shout outs that are going around. I guess my first shout out is to our CEO, Alan Whitman at Baker Tilly. They say, leaders really shine in times of crisis. And, I've always said that there are some leaders that really shouldn't be leaders because they can't deal with stressful situations. I've never really experienced a leader like Alan, who not only is compassionate about the professionals within the firm, but also sends a very compelling message. And the communications that we get on a regular and ongoing basis are not only targeted, but they actually make sense. And, the one thing that I keep getting away from the messaging that we're getting, as we go through this time of crisis and we've executed on our business continuity plan is, to do the right thing, do the right thing in all situations. And remember that, at the end of the day, we are human beings, and that, people do have, certain needs and wants, and that, in times of crisis, that those things have changed, and that we need to bend and blend accordingly. And, we talk about that amongst ourselves on a regular and ongoing basis. But I think the way that the messages get delivered from him are just remarkable. And, I've never really been involved in an organization where I've seen a leader like that, especially one in the CEO slot, really take control like he has and surround himself with the right people in order to make really good and effective decisions. So shout out to Alan. And my rant, this week would probably be to the fact that I really don't understand sometimes, what our regulators are thinking with regards to enforcement. I'm not going to call out any one regulator specifically, but there seems to be a lot of interesting communications that have been or stories that have been released over the last week and a half. And I just find it kind of odd that, a lot of them are contradictory. So that's my shout out, my rant for this week. So thanks for having me, Tom.
Jay Rosen.
So I'll be quick. I'm on low battery power, but my shout out goes to the millions of entrepreneurs who are out there who are retooling their supply chains and supply lines, who are making PPE, who are making masks, who are doing hand sanitizer. And it just gives me courage. And I just love the fact that so many individuals are joining the fight. But then at the same time, you have some major industrial powers that are quibbling with the Trump administration about where they send their goods or which machines they can work on. So here to the little guy. We're all in this together. And thanks to you and the first responders for doing all that you do. It really, we appreciate it here in Simi Valley, and I know people around the world appreciate it as well.
Yeah, well said, Jay.
I'm going to have two shout outs. The first one is to Compliance Week, who for their Compliance Lifetime Achievement Award, their first annual, was awarded to Carrie Penman, the Chief Compliance Officer at Navex Global. I can't think of anyone more deserving in our community for that award. So shout out to Compliance Week, shout out to Carrie Penman. My other shout out goes to the coolest guy in compliance. Yes, indeed, panelist Matt Kelly for his terming of COVIDiocy. What is COVIDiocy? COVIDiocy is companies who engage in idiotic, inane behavior during the COVID-19 health crisis. Matt wrote about this in a blog post this week. We explored it at some depth in Compliance Into the Weeds. So please don't engage in COVIDiocy, because if you do, Matt Kelly may well write about you. Gentlemen, this has been a great podcast. Thanks for everyone and taking the time to prepare and do this podcast. Until next time.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. Thank you for listening to this episode of Everything Compliance. I wanted to put out a very lengthy podcast to see if that is something our community would like to see more of. So if you have any feedback on the length of this podcast, in addition to its content, please let me know at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. I hope you will plan to join us again for another episode of Everything Compliance. Everything Compliance is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network and a proud member of C-Suite Radio. Stay safe out there, and we look forward to visiting with you again.